So returning back to the fundamental principle, the existence of these economic profits suggests there's some type of market inefficiency. So our job as strategic analysts, our task is to identify ways in which these market inefficiencies arise and how firms might be able to capitalize on them to gain these economic profits that we're interested in. Now, an obvious question would be, well, are markets perfectly competitive? Is that what we observe in practice? Well, the facts are, and this is good for business, is that in fact markets aren't perfectly competitive, that there are often various inefficiencies that allow for firms to profit in the economic profit terms. If we just look at the facts, average industry returns vary across industries, even controlling for risk. What this basically means is some industries are simply more profitable than others, not surprising. Interestingly, returns among companies with industries vary even more. So in other words, even within an industry, we see even greater variance than we see across industries. And then finally, returns for individual companies vary over time. We talked about Kodak last session. Kodak, a highly profitable firm for many, many years, now with a technological shift, finding themselves going bankrupt. And the chart you see on this slide is a very stylized representation of three different industries here. You see the density here, the distribution of the companies within those industries and the returns on the x-axis. And the point is the following. We'll see differences in terms of average industry profitability. Pharmaceuticals on average are more profitable than computers. And we'll also see differences in terms of their variance. Textiles has a very high variance where there's some very, very profitable firms on one end, and then some firms who are really struggling and often fail and go out of business. Computers, on the other hand, we might see a much more narrower distribution of profitability within that industry. So at the end of the day, our job as strategic analysts is really analyzing the sources of these economic profits. There's a great quote in Brealey and Meyer's seminal textbook, Principles of Corporate Finance, where they talk about exactly this issue in the context of measuring economic rents, as we talked about before. When you are presented with a project that appears to have a positive NPV, net present value, don't just accept the calculations at face value. They may reflect simple estimation errors in forecasting future cash flows. Probe behind cash flow estimates and try to identify the source of economic rents. Positive NPV for a project is believable only if you believe that company has some special advantage. And I've highlighted this notion of try to identify the source of economic rents. That's what we're going to try to do here as strategic analysts. And really where we're going for a number of sessions here is diving deeper into potential generic sources of economic rents. And in particular, we're going to talk about three different types of economic rents that can be created: monopoly rents, Ricardian rents, and Schumpeterian rents. Let me describe each in turn. The notion of monopoly rents comes from a branch of economics referred to as industrial organization economics. Industrial organization economics is very interested in the potential for firms to have market power, and actually is very informative to issues around antitrust and the like. In the industrial organization view, monopoly rents exist when there are some barriers to entry. In essence, that industry structure matters. So let's go back to our t-shirt vendor case. How could our t-shirt vendor avoid the fate of a competitive market? Well, one possibility is perhaps you need a license to be able to sell t-shirts outside the stadium. To the extent that those licenses are a scarce good, that then restricts entry into the market and allows for firms who are able to get one of these licenses to do very well and to profit from that. So the ability to stop that entry and to stop that shift out of the supply curve will allow firms who are within the industry to profit from playing there in terms of economic profits. The second perspective we'll talk about are what are sometimes referred to as Ricardian rents, after Ricardo, a famous economist from the 19th century. What David Ricardo and others have talked about is the notion that there might be barriers to imitation. In the strategy literature, we refer to this as the resource-based view. Unlike structural barriers that prevent entry, the idea here is that while there might be entry into the industry, there are things that prevent companies from copying one another. So let's go back to our t-shirt vendor case here. In the t-shirt vendor case, perhaps you have some type of copyright or some type of trademark on the design on your t-shirt that prevents others from copying you. So that while others might enter the industry and start selling t-shirts, they can't sell exactly the same t-shirt as you. And as a result, you can continue to do very well despite the fact that entry is occurring. This is in essence this idea of competitive advantage that we talked about in last session, being able to do things better than those within your industry segment. Geographically, you see it represented here in terms of a cost advantage. Imagine two firms, firm 1 and firm 2, that simply have different cost structures. For the same level of price, we might find one firm just barely profitable, if not profitable at all, whereas another might find their cost structure lower, in this case firm number 1, and be able to profit still from selling despite the fact that others are struggling within the market. So the essence of the resource-based view here is that, once again, there are barriers to imitation, and that firm capabilities and firm structure really matter here in terms of achieving these economic rents. A third perspective we'll talk about a little later is what is sometimes referred to as Schumpeterian rents, after Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian economist who was a professor at Harvard for many years. And Schumpeter is probably most famous for coining the phrase, the gales of creative destruction. This is what's sometimes referred to in the strategy literature as the dynamic capabilities view of strategy or economic rents. This is a recognition that markets are dynamic, that innovation matters. What you see illustrated here is the idea that technologies evolve, that over time technologies are replaced as new technologies come along that are better and replace those technologies. And you see these different stages over time within industry segments. If you take our t-shirt vendor case, it may very well be that you come up with a novel design, you have no protection on it, there's no way to prevent others from copying you, but because you're the first to market, you have at least a brief window in which you can achieve these economic rents before others copy you. Perhaps you have an innate ability to do these types of designs, and so while everybody copies your design in the next time, the next game, you come out with yet another new design that's even better, that attracts even more customers. And it's kind of this idea of constantly staying ahead of the masses here as they imitate you and copy you that allows you to get the economic rents that we're interested in. Some might point to Apple as a company who's been very good about this in recent years, of coming out with new products and new product classifications that are constantly ahead of those imitating what they introduced to the market perhaps a few months or a few years before. So let me end with a couple of lessons here that I want you to take away. If there's only one thing you remember from this series of lectures, it is the fundamental principle. In perfectly competitive markets, no firm realizes economic profits. This is a critical principle for business strategy and something that I find that is sometimes missed in the popular business press. We get so enamored with markets and demand that we forget about competition. Going back to my Pets.com example, it wasn't that there wasn't a market demand for online pet supplies. There most definitely was. It was the competitive aspect and the inability to prevent others from doing exactly the same business model that ultimately doomed the likes of Pets.com. Second thing I'd like you to remember is this notion of economic profits, this idea that they are returns in excess of the opportunity cost of capital. This is kind of above and beyond just your normal accounting profits. Finally, we want to remember that in the real world, product markets are rarely perfect and that firms often have competitive advantage. And thankfully this is true, or there would be no reason to have business strategists or perhaps even business schools. It is this idea that we can capitalize on these inefficiencies that allows us to have competitive advantage and has us something that's really interesting and interesting to analyze. Finally, broadly speaking, firms may capture these economic profits in one of two ways. Either there are barriers to competition, this industrial organization viewpoint, or there are barriers to imitation, this resource-based viewpoint. And I'll highlight once again that over the next couple sessions, we're going to take a deeper dive into each of these perspectives and talk about how industry structure affects profitability and then how firm capabilities affect profitability. Thank you very much.